Well, welcome to another edition of Pod of the Gaps with me, Michael Otts, and my friends Andy Bannister and Aaron Edwards. This is the podcast that seeks to get people thinking about the big issues of life with a blend of theology and cultural comment and banter and stuff like that. You're welcome to join us. This is, I think, episode
19.
19 episodes.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a friend who recently just commented that they've been listening to all of them on a journey. I thought it must be a very long journey by now because they seem to have got longer as we go along. But there you go.
Well, the traffic jams around Birmingham can be quite bad these days, so maybe it's just a particularly bad.
We should actually have that. That should be our kind of, our selling point, shouldn't it? The unique selling point that we are your accompaniment to Spaghetti Junction. So you can find yourself going around there. We'll get you through it.
Maybe in the future they'll measure traffic jams by episodes of Pod of the Gaps. This is Pod of the Gap episode traffic jam.
I like that. In fact, it reminds me of growing up. One of my favourite reads was Adrian Plass. You remember the Sacred Diary of Adrian?
Yeah.
Kind of Plass, more known to British Christians, but also internationally, kind of a sort of funny take on Christian life. And in that, he talks about rating sermons by fruit pastels. That was a 4 fruit pastel sermon. And I always thought that's the measure of how long someone preaches for. So I like the idea of being this is a 4.5 podcast journey.
Yeah. I guess it depends which episode, of course. But
so we could rename it then, Michael. Pod of the Gas for America.
Yes, I like it.
Pod of the Gas.
Come on, Aaron, your turn.
What, a rename?
No, to think of a pun off the top of it.
Oh, you can't put me on a pun spot. I should make a pun on being put on the spot, but I can't even do that. I've been jarred. My systems are fried.
There you go. Well, we'll leave the puns to Andy. But as we say, Pod of the Gaps, we're here to look at different topics. Some of the topics are things that everybody is talking about. But one of the things that we want to do on Pod of the Gaps is maybe take some topics that aren't necessarily being talked about, but should perhaps be talked about more. And I think today is definitely one of those subjects as we think about the pornification of culture. And actually, this is, I think, a massive issue, and yet not one that perhaps is being talked about as much as it should be. Andy, would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I think it is very much the case, Michael. I've been struck by this increasingly in recent months. Having spent a bit more time this last year because of lockdown, also because of the podcast and things on social media, struck that there are justice issues everywhere. Black Lives Matter. Folk battling the transgender thing or the LGBT stuff. Those we just had Pride, haven't we? And to go, all those flags and issues and campaigns are everywhere. So we seem to live in a society in which people are more switched on to justice, but very few people are talking about pornography. And sometimes when Christians talk about it, all we do is talk about it in kind of the moral frame. But I'm interested in the injustice frame. We may come back to this, but if you take the world's biggest porn website, Pornhub, which gets 3.5 billion visits a month, that's more than Netflix, more than Amazon, and so on, was a massive expose of Pornhub last year in the New York Times, written by Nicholas Kristof, called The Children of Pornhub, when he looked at the number of videos on that site that were, rape, abuse, child pornography, stuff that, that wasn't just unpleasant, that was outright illegal there on the world's biggest porn site. That did at least cause a massive kind of sort of public outpouring of angst. And as a result, Pornhub removed 10 million of its 13 million videos. I mean, just process that stat for a minute. 10 million of their 13 million videos back there in the end of last year, they decided were actually so bad they were actually probably illegal and they'd got sued. So that's an injustice issue. That's women whose lives have been wrecked because videos of them in various sort of inappropriate ways have been uploaded onto that website. And so it just begins. So I think the fact that people don't talk about that injustice, and then the other thing, Michael, and I know Aaron has stuff to say on this too. That one of the podcasts that we love, the three of us I know follow and admire, are the folks over at Trigonometry, and if you've never listened to that, it's a brilliant website run by two comedians, and looking at some of these cultural issues from a more secular perspective. And what's interesting, they cover a lot of the big stuff that we cover, and in particular, I was struck by the fact a few months ago they had Abigail Shrier on. We've talked about Abigail's book, Irreversible Damage, which is her book looking at the damage that's being done to young teenage women, especially around the teenage girls, especially around the transgender movement. And she links that very strongly to pornography, because young women, one of her theses is that young women are being exposed to this horrific view of what sex looks like in terms of, meeting young boys whose view of sex has been shaped by Pornhub, So these guys think that it's okay to, hit, bite, slap, choke women. And so women are reacting against that. And one of the ways they're reacting against that is going into transgender. It's much safer to identify as a man than face toxic masculinity. And Abigail's book on that is great. And they did a fantastic episode on that, on trigonometry. Yet the very next episode, they were advertising, VPN, virtual private network services. And there was a sort of joke in the advert that this is the kind of service you could use, so you could look at websites, that you probably, wouldn't want your mum or your granny realizing you'd watch. And there was a sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink quality to it. And I was saying before the show began, I'm very tempted to write to those two and go, guys, you need some consistency here. Brilliant on flagging up the issues around transgender and young women, but you haven't talked about the elephant in the room of injustice, which is what the porn trade is doing, both to those within it, but also particularly to young women who are being exposed to this increasingly pornified culture.
That's interesting. I mean, funny enough, I've never actually listened to trigonometry, but I've had it fed to me through you almost. But
Andy has just said that you're a big fan.
I take it all back. I thought you were there.
You thought I was a believer, but I think from what I think I saw them do an interview once, and I thought, they're saying lots of key things here on similar stuff that we would notice, really, I guess, but from, as you say, from a secular angle, and that's where it's quite important. That's in a way that's sort of where we are. One of the visions behind this podcast, isn't it? That we're seeing lots of non-Christians. We've mentioned a few of them on the show, Doug Murray and Jordan Peterson and all the others, who are seeing stuff and calling it out. But not from a Christian perspective. They might even be sympathetic to Christianity, but they're not bringing some particular angle on it. And the Christians are far too limp-wristed to want to do anything about it, to actually speak out on these things for fear of getting in trouble. So it's kind of filling in that gap. So, but yes, I do think that this is a real incongruity, as you say, between the kinds of issues that people advocate for. There's so much to say on this. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but I guess I'd probably start with the impact of the sexual revolution, because it's been known for many years how ludicrous it is to tell women that you are liberated from the power of men. So we don't need to tell men to be gentlemen anymore, because that would almost assume a kind of chauvinism. So you can let men be as terrible as they like, in a way, or leave them to them, as long as they do it in a controlled way, which doesn't really happen like that anyway, because you see the kinds of crimes that are specifically male against women haven't seemed to have gone down, have they, since the sexual revolution? You could argue they've actually gone up. And pornography is a huge, huge factor in actually transposing those sort of fantasies into the real world, as it were. And I think there's so many terrible things for women that have come out of the sexual revolution, which promise them to be free of male sexual dominance. And so there's a ridiculous. You can't even laugh at it. It's almost. It's one of those ironies that's just so tragic. It's absolutely awful. And the rise of pornography has just been pervasive. And it's been a really, really bad thing for women. And I think even over lockdown, remember there was that whole thing about prostitutes, now of course called sex workers, having their rights, needing to be advocated and complaining, and people advocating for them, saying, look, these people are workers too. They have a service to provide. And I just think it's another indication of how sick our culture is, that we invent terms for things because we don't want to seem like we're being self-righteous. Oh, we used to call them prostitutes. How terrible. And they were outcasts. Oh, now, of course, there's a love for all the outcasts that we need to show as Christians. Jesus does go and speak with prostitutes and is kind-hearted to them and doesn't bring the kind of sword of Damocles above them in the way the Pharisees might have done. But at the same time, he calls them to leave their life of sin. And I think we don't like to call sin anymore. And not only that, we like to baptize it and actually say it's a virtue. And so things like sex working and using those terms feed into this kind of culture where we're apparently advocating for women's rights and liberation from all these things like toxic masculinity, when at the same time we're actually propping up the very system that keeps all of that going and keeps men objectifying women in really unbelievable and sometimes, as you say, Andy, cruel ways. And it's just there going on all the time, pervasively in the background, and sometimes it creeps into the foreground too.
I mean, just very quickly, because I don't want to get on this particular kind of rabbit trail, but you mentioned the prostitution piece. It was interesting. During my time when I was in Canada from 2010 to 2016, my wife got connected with actually several organizations working in terms of helping the victims of human trafficking and the connection between prostitution and human trafficking. And now we know there's a connection between human trafficking and the porn trade. What was interesting, I remember coming across a piece of work written by a Canadian journalist called Victor Malarak, who wrote an amazing book called The Johns, looking at the men who buy sex. And then there was one called The Natashas, looking at the women who sell it. And he did an amazing piece of work, picking up on a few surveys of, as sex workers, as they were called in Canada, and exploring the question of how many of them actually want to be there. And the staggering statistic is that 93% of those engaged in prostitution or sex work, or whatever you call it in Canada, didn't want to be there. Wow. They would have done anything to get out. And Victor in his book just exposes that stat and says, can we not see there's a problem here? Or the fact that in Vancouver, the vast majority of women in the sex trade were from Indigenous First Nations communities, where things like, drug abuse, poverty, you run incredibly high. And the idea those women have freely chosen to come to the big city and sell sex to largely, not only, but obviously largely to rich men. Can we not see a problem here? And one last thought, actually, then pass back to Mike, is as you said that we talked about the incongruity. The other thing that struck me the other day, I can't remember why I suddenly thought of this as we were prepping for this podcast, Aaron, is that like you guys, I've written books, and the last book I wrote for IVP. On the Muslims and Christians book, another cheap plug, which we authors have to do. And during the editing process, my editor there a couple of times called me out on using the male gaze. They were like, you can just change the way you phrase that because you've written it, kind of male type way. If you write it this way, it's more inclusive. And so in literature, we try and avoid the male gaze. And it's a good thing to do. Don't use a metaphor or a turn of phrase that seems to be just referring to men when it could be anybody. And it was great to learn how to do that better. It just occurred to me, of course, the one place we've never had that conversation is when it comes to pornography in our culture. So we're so conscious about increasing the number of women in leadership positions in Fortune 500 companies, making sure there's representation, making sure on TV screens, we remake classic movies like Ghostbusters, stick women in there so it's not the male gaze. But when it comes to pornography, no one goes there. It's almost like there's this sort of blank spot on the map that says, here be dragons, and people don't go there. And I think as Christians, if we are going to stand up for those who are the victim of injustice, we have to go there. We have to talk about these issues. I think maybe for Christians, we're afraid of being labelled as prudish. Maybe we're afraid of the fact that many Christians have problems with pornography, and we're afraid of being accused of hypocrisy. But if we don't speak up for the voiceless, who is going to?
Absolutely. Just before we move on, just one little point on the language piece. A good friend of mine was working in Cape Town with women on the streets, and she just picked me up because I used the term prostitutes, and she said, actually use the expression women in prostitution. Don't make it the ultimate defining thing about that person. And I think there's a danger that we define this person as they're a prostitute and nothing more. No, number one, they're created in the image of God. They're a woman who often, against their will, has been caught up in this. But equally, don't change the terminology. Like, let's just call it a sex worker to make it sound not so bad. And we're saying, no, actually.
That's a good point. My only the footnote on that, though, Michael, would obviously be that, the Gospels refer to people as, the Bible refers to people as prostitutes. So would we say then the Bible writers are incorrect when they do so because they're identifying that person only with it? It's tricky. But that's a whole other thing.
There's a topic for another.
Yeah, there's another topic
for another show, isn't there?
Moving back though, because that's not the main focus. Obviously, I think you probably picked up, listener, by now, if you haven't already, that we see this as a problem, and we say, one of the problems actually is that many people in our culture don't. So, for example, trigonometry, happy to point out lots of other issues. When it comes to pornography, kind of we're happy to make jokes about it. And actually, we were just saying before the show, normally we have a lot of banter, and actually we felt this would just be inappropriate to do because just as you wouldn't banter about paedophilia or something which everyone knows is so utterly destructive, we don't want to banter about something that we feel is destructive. But I guess one of the questions is, why do we think this is destructive? And I know that there are women who use pornography as well, but predominantly statistics would suggest this is a male problem. So why particularly is this a problem for men who use pornography? But also, as we mentioned, why is it also an issue for women as well? Aaron, do you want to kick us off? So why for the user of pornography is this so destructive?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things, obviously, in pornography per se. Now, pornography has clearly been around for centuries. There's obviously pornographic images in the ancient world, and it's a significant issue to, I guess, imagize, you might say, or to someone else, objectify them for the purposes of your own sexual gratification. That is just a perennial human problem, and it does seem to be more prominent. No, it is always more prominent amongst males. As much as I was saying to you guys earlier, I've often heard people do talks on pornography or sexuality, and make the kind of striking claim that women use pornography as much as men. I think there are other forms of it. I think there's other kind of forms of the kind of fantasies and things like this, which women will obviously indulge in, and there'll be media to suit that. But I don't think it just isn't. I mean, I think you mentioned, Michael, a book you were reading. What book was it that had a statistic that did counter that oft-made claim that women use it as much as men?
Wired for Intimacy by William Struthers. How pornography hijacks the male brain. So basically, he's saying, like, it's not exclusively a male problem, but he says actually, when you look at it, this is predominantly a male problem still.
Yeah, and we have to see it in those terms. And I think the thing I was saying earlier about the sexual revolution was we've, in trying to move away from societal patriarchy, liberating women in various ways, in various stages, it gets into a place where, again, the men in the modern world don't know how to be men. They aren't really allowed to be men. They're always being told that they need to comply with a certain standards, which are often very impossible to fulfill. And I think pornography offers a release for the loss of masculinity in Western culture. Now, some people say, "Oh, that's terrible. That's not true. Toxic masculinity is rife, and these men are always going around controlling everything." Actually, I think there's a loss of good masculinity. We keep threatening to do an episode on muscular Christianity, which we must do at some point, because that was one. There's loads of stuff to say on that about how there's a good, vibrant masculinity which is different to femininity, and there's an important God-given kind of characteristic to cultivate. And I don't think men are allowed to do that societally anymore, because it looks like you're trying to do so against women in some way. And therefore, pornography creates this sort of fantasy world, just like video games do, in the sense that you can go and have your sort of fix of something in the worst possible way, and the kind of more extreme behaviors come out, which wouldn't ever happen in real life, you'd say. Now, I think in the digital world, the digitization of porn, it really just ramps up several levels. So, I'm sure we've all struggled with pornography in our lifetime. We won't do a whole confession time. I struggled massively with pornography, and it does stuff to your brain in the sense that you can't remove some of those images. It's very difficult to, and the kind of persistent use really does have a long-term effect. And we've had and when you get married, it has impact, and you have to kind of talk through these things. It's almost like you've been with all of these, you've imagized all of these other women for many years. And it's not the kind of thing which just it's a short-term thing that just kind of disappears. It can have long-term effects on the brain. There's neural pathway stuff which we've talked about with the digital world in general. Now, for porn, that's even more of a problem, because your brain gets used to a certain hit of dopamine, and it knows where to go to get that, and it's the same effect as being addicted to heroin or something. This is where I go to get this precise feeling, and eventually people don't really even want to go. If they're married, for example, and they're still using pornography, they won't want to go to the place that's created for. So marital intimacy with your spouse, that's no longer as appealing as these sort of more dramatic images that they can find with the pornification, with the availability that you have there. So the access goes up in the digital world. The way it affects your brain goes up in the digital world, and rewires your brain to create kind of neural pathways so that you have to go there again and again. And the more you use it, the more you want it, and then the less it satisfies. So you have to go further and further, which is why what Andy was saying earlier, the more horrendous, dramatic stuff kind of tends to come in. So I've heard, I remember mentoring a guy many years ago struggling with this, and he ended up saying he eventually got into watching gay porn, and he wasn't gay. I was like, what? That didn't really make any sense to me. But what he was saying was he kind of got into a place where he was so desensitized and bored, but he had this desire for more. And where does he go when he's exhausted all that the pornography? Well, there's another taboo. There's this. So maybe that would be arousing to him. And that's where you get into all these other areas, because it keeps feeding you with the desire for more and more, and it never actually satisfies you. So it's kind of the essence obviously that's the essence of sin in many ways, but it does have significant effects on marital intimacy, on again the brain, let alone how you look at and treat other women. The fact that people are leading double lives has huge mental health effects. Even just as human beings, it's just a bad idea. I've often said that to non-Christians when I talk to them. You don't have a moral, let's say a Christian reason. Maybe they should have a moral reason, actually, for the stuff Andy mentioned earlier about objectifying women, but there's no Christian religious reason for them not to, as we might as Christians have that. I would say just it's not good for you anyway. Like it's a bad thing for you. And do you feel guilty when you do it? And they're like, yeah, I do feel guilty. And that's interesting, isn't it? Why do you feel guilty? Why do you recognize there's something about this that's not right? So, there's all these sort of things that play into it. But like I said, the digitization ramps it up, because when we were younger, when we were teenagers especially, it was harder to get hold of. And it was like a more, at school, someone might have a magazine or something, or they had sight of one and a story about one or whatever. It was so clearly the desires are still there, but the fact that everyone's got it on their phones and they can get it and send it to one another so easy, the access goes up and the anonymity goes up with that. So those two things, access and anonymity, create a worse culture for the individual, because they can just live double lives and they can get as much as they want for free, and they just gets them into that slipstream. Quicker.
One thing very quickly I'd add to that, and I know Michael looks like he's got other questions going. I absolutely agree. Access, anonymity, but also the viral quality. Because if you look at the way that you have things like revenge porn, where somebody who's been in a woman's been in a relationship, the relationship was broken up, and the guy she's with has taken some intimate images and then goes and shares those to get back. When we were teenagers, that was pretty much impossible. If you had if you had a photograph of somebody, I could, like you say, I can remember when I was at school, word spread that somebody had a photograph, and maybe there might be a few guys behind the bike sheds, and this aura of like, wow, and lots of Christian teens like myself also got caught up in that and had to deal with that, right? But it stayed there. That's where it went. Now it gets onto social media, it gets onto Pornhub, it gets magnified, and some poor woman gets her life ruined because the jerk that she was with manages to get a kind of viral view behind the thing. And that Nicholas Kristof piece that I mentioned, we'll put a link to this in the show notes. He has an interview there with several people that happened to, and one woman talking about the fact, I have repeatedly had to go to Pornhub and say, can you take these images down? Just images that were filmed of me without my consent have now been viewed 500, 600, 700,000 times, and every time I get them taken down, they go up again. So I think technology has a big part to play in this. So all these things connect, don't they? One of the things we're finding, I think, on Pod of the Gaps, these things all intersect.
Absolutely. It was fascinating. A while back, I noticed that the BBC had run a few articles, I think, on basically asking the question, why are people having less sex? Surveys showing that, the irony, of course, of the sexual revolution, that, we're all promised that this is going to mean that we all have more and better sex. And the reality is that statistics show, however those statistics were gained, I don't know, but that people are not. And actually, although the article didn't join the dots to the cause, I'm sure one of the things is that we're now living in a virtual world where it's a lot easier to click on your phone and find pornography to satisfy you, rather than actually going through the difficult thing of connecting with another human being who has emotions and feelings, who doesn't respond in the way that a computer does. And actually, one of the ironies we're starting to see that this is having implications for our culture, and just fascinating in terms of kind of incidental conversations. My wife chatting to colleagues who would say, actually, they're just not attracted to their wife anymore because they've looked at so much porn that it's desensitized them. And they're now starting to see these. And, like you say, Aaron, they're not Christians kind of grappling with this many kind of Christian moral points of view. It's just actually, I'm now living with the implications of these choices that I've made, and I'm starting to see the kind of bitter fruits of them in my own life. So we'll think maybe about how we can help people in this situation, if you're thinking kind of this is really, really depressing. But we don't just want to see this, though, from a kind of like a guy using pornography point of view as a problem. And I think this is one of the issues that often when we're trying to help people who are addicted to pornography, we're saying, this is really, really bad for you. It is. But actually, as we've already mentioned, this is really, really destructive for the women who are often caught up in this. Andy, you were mentioning that already earlier. This is a justice issue, right? It's not just a problem, a kind of moral problem. This has got wider implications.
Yeah, I think so. So I think in terms of a Christian response to this, because obviously we don't just want to comment on the issues, we want to think about them in a Christian on this podcast. I mean, a couple of things occur. Well, right at the top, actually, one thing occurs. So when Aaron was talking a minute ago, I was reminded of that verse in Romans. I read it this morning in my devotions. The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. And that really, in the interesting contrast there between, when you're living in that, under that, addiction to sin, you're earning, it's wages. What you're earning, you think you're getting freedom, but actually what you're actually ultimately earning is death. And then the other side of things that you have on the God equation, you have it's the free gift. It's not that you have to earn this and get your life right first. It's the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. And so I think where that flows out for me in this is a couple of things. I think the church, probably needs to do a better job in terms of talking about this. I have a friend who's a Christian counselor of many years' experience, and he gave me a statistic that he thinks from his just personal, not just the literature, but the experience of years of counseling, that something like 20 to 25% of pastors and church leaders are struggling with pornography, and it's a slightly higher figure for Christians as a whole. But I think the church very rarely talks about this issue other than simply to condemn it. And how do we still talk about the harm that it does, but also create the space for saying the people in the church, mainly men, but also women, who are struggling with it, there is help and support, not condemnation. How do we be communities where people are actually encouraged to stand up and go, this is the sin that I'm grappling with, and they find, rather than, right, get out, you miserable sinner, they're okay, we will get the support, we will walk with you, we will help you put the structure. And there's been lots of work done, I think, showing when it comes to pornography that actually, support groups which enable people to talk about it and process it and provide accountability to each other. There are technological accountability tools that you can sign up for, but there's also the old-fashioned way. So I think the church needs to do a better job really on how we help disciples as they limp their way along, along the way following Christ. Sometimes we give the impression that if you're not perfect, then there's no place for you. And I think for many young people, that's a massive issue. If you feel that I can't be a full member of the body of Christ because this is part of my life that I haven't got sorted. And then I think secondly, I think there's a huge opportunity here for the church to blaze a trail in talk about this issue. It's interesting that one of the biggest social media campaigns in the last few years on pornography has been a campaign called Fight the New Drug, who have some amazing digital media stuff and do a wonderful work, I think, fighting this issue. But that's the Mormon church behind that. And that doesn't, for Christians listening, that doesn't devalue what they're doing. But I look at that stuff and go, man, why are more Christians not at the forefront of talking about this issue? We have been in the past. We were at the forefront of fighting the slave trade. We were at the forefront more recently of debt reduction. Remember Jubilee 2000? That was a Christian campaign. Fair trade. Christians were hugely involved in the campaign for fair trade products. The Anglican Church was a huge amount of pressure on things like Nescafe, to sort of sort out their coffee production. So Christians have been at the forefront of, over the years, many justice campaigns. I think this is the issue, and the connected things of human trafficking and the go with it. There's a little basket of issues that go together. But to find a way of talking about it, it's not simply we think porn is wrong. Everybody outside the church knows that Christians think pornography is wrong. What we need to be doing is speaking up for the victims, explaining why it's wrong, why it's such an injustice, and leading the campaign to get to a world where it is no longer considered acceptable, for a company like Pornhub to operate.
Do you know, though, Andy, the funny thing is, I would first, those really interesting points. I think that's spot on, that we need to create a better environment where we're more open, accountable, in the best way as the church. And actually, obviously, one of the ways that, say, Satan, who obviously the word Satan, the term really means the accuser, will come and almost doubly attack Christians when they struggle with that, or anyone, but especially Christians, because it could be, firstly, it's the temptation element. This is going to be amazing and be fulfilling, and you will certainly be, this is definitely a good decision, a good choice. And then as soon as it's over, an immediate switch to the other side of condemnation, where it's actually the Christian life should be one where you're actually rigorous and fulfilled in God to the extent where you're going to be able to resist that temptation. And that's hard, and you need to be able to do it within community, and that means being open and fellowship really being fellowship. And so often the church does not live up to the wonderful image we have of it in the early church. And I don't mean the early church as the ideal church, because they had as many problems as we have. The Corinthian church was horrendous with sexual immorality, for example. but there's still something about the ideal there of how we're supposed to be in each other's lives, praying for each other, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to one another, living this life of God's body on earth, and really glorifying God through how we are as communities. And I don't think we do a great job of that, especially when we talk about moral issues separate. And that's what gets people of any marginalized group, let's say even gay people who would be, we talked about before, feel marginalized because they're feeling the church says moral things but isn't living the kind of ideal of grace that they talk about. Now the thing is, I'd say on the other side is that just how we've baptized sin in loads of other ways relating to homosexuality and other things, I wonder whether non-Christians know that Christians think pornography is wrong across the board. I don't know, because the amount of pressure in culture to actually almost justify it to some people, it could lead to a sense in which people don't think it's wrong. And then Christians have been very good at listening to the world on all sorts of other things. So why wouldn't they listen to it on this as well? So that's another thing. We have to maintain our wits about us and be able to be salt and light and discerning over the challenges that are coming against us, the kind of assaults of the enemy on very, clear biblical condemnations of sexual immorality. And I think pornography does come into that. And so we mustn't get into a place where we go, we're so worried about seeming self-righteous and Pharisaic that we don't call things out. But as you say, that the other issue is that people don't even talk about it. So you've got especially lots of young men who think they're the only ones who struggle with it. So they don't mention it. They think everyone else is perfectly holy. But really, you remember church youth groups, virtually everyone most of the guys are struggling with it and thinking they're the only ones and not talking. And then whenever there's a big discussion together, it's always really fruitful, what often is, because people have got that space to be honest. And I think just cultivating that honesty in the church is a huge thing that we need to get back to.
Absolutely. And I think that sense of church being community, genuinely real community where we can talk. I mean, I was very helped by having a pastor friend who we had an accountability setup where he'd text me every Monday morning, and knowing that text was coming every Monday to say how things going was a great help and a challenge. So I think that's there. And I think one of the things I found personally, and I think is good to emphasize, is, we're seeing increasingly how it is self-destructive. So we're not just saying this is bad because we're being prudish, but also, as we've said, this is an issue of justice in terms of, do you really want to feed an industry that is, enslaving people, ruining people's lives? Do you want to be part of that? And even if they're not, even if the women involved have signed up freely, do you want to be part of something which is basically degrading and treating someone as less than created in the image of God, and actually helping people to see it out of their own kind of selfish kind of me in the computer to actually, this is a bigger issue. This is involving real people. How does my actions affect the way I view others? It could be a helpful one. Another thing, just listening to that book actually that I was mentioning earlier, and Wired for Intimacy. One of the quotes in the book was fascinating. It was talking about how pornography has become the new ibuprofen. So actually, why do a lot of men turn to pornography? Often it's a kind of self-medicating way of dealing with frustration, with disappointment, with loneliness. And in a way, sometimes as the church, we're tackling the symptom, which is this guy's addicted to porn. And actually, sometimes we need to go to the cause, which is, okay, why is this person turning to pornography as a way of relief? It's not going to do it, but why are they turning to that? And actually, the beautiful thing about the Christian community and the gospel is actually, it's hopefully drawing us into community. It's giving us a sense of purpose. It's dealing with our guilt and so on. And so in a sense, we tackle this issue not just head on, but we tackle this issue by looking at the underlying issues. And I know, speaking from personal experience, that actually, when we're actively involved in church and community, have a sense of purpose, that really helps. Not because I'm spending the whole time thinking, shouldn't look at pornography, but in a sense because I haven't got some of those other issues which would lead me to be tempted in that way.
It's often the case, isn't it, that when people are struggling, other things are going on. Like they're not, they're not as devotional in their Bible reading or prayer life. Those things, it's very difficult to maintain a healthy prayer and scriptural life while struggling incessantly with that. Whereas actually it tends to be those things erode and they're correlated, and you don't think they are. You just think, oh no, that this is just a difficult, I'm just in a bit of a dip, but actually the dip is bigger and wider than you realize, which is again why accountability is so important there. Yeah, sorry, Andy.
I know. I was just going to affirm really what Michael said there, that I think you're right. That I think unless particularly the boredom piece, I think is another big piece of it. Well, I think COVID has made that worse. With I think a lot of people not knowing what they're there for, what life is for, and so just sort of root around for anything that will sort of take away, distract from, the rigmarole of the everyday. I mean, the Romans had bread and circuses. Today we have porn and Netflix. There's that going on. And then the final piece as well, I know we're almost out of time, so I don't want to open too many more rabbit trails, but I also think that this is a theme that's run through other part of the Gaps episodes. There's the whole Gnostic sort of thing that is everywhere in our culture. That's behind the transgender piece. It's all about your mind and your feelings. Don't worry, forget about the body. The body's bad. Cut it, hack it, manipulate it. And in the porn trade, the pornography, the same thing is going on. What matters is that that feeling you have as you look at that image and do whatever you do. You don't, as we've talked about, don't start getting involved in messy stuff where you have to, share life with that other person and bring them soup when they've got flu and deal with them with all of their kind of messy humanness. Rather, we can extract all of that and then have this very transactional view of intimacy, which is, there's the person on the screen, I pay my money, I have this little burst of happiness and the job is done. Whereas again, I think the gospel, one of the things I love about the gospel is it's so thoroughly anti-Gnostic. God could have just sent us a series of ideas. Don't look at pornography, think about this. But actually Jesus steps into the whole of the human frame. And yes, he brings ideas, but he also steps in physically as well. And of course, the other thing I think is helpful for Christians when dealing with the condemnation piece, I love that verse in scriptures talk about Jesus being tempted in every way, which means for guys, Jesus struggled with sexual temptation, but didn't succumb, didn't, pollute his thought life. And we have a model, we have a great high priest who does understand and has been through this life with all of the things that throws at us. And I think that's something to hang on to too, because I think sometimes, for Christians, there could be that sort of sense of going, I've fallen short, Christ can't possibly understand, I'm no good, rather to have a saviour who goes, no, I do understand, because I've wrestled with all the same things that you have, and I'm willing to meet you where you are, pick you up, and put you back together again. And I think that's an issue the world needs to hear a lot of, because we live in an increasingly condemnatory world where people are very quick to say, right, you've messed up, you're on the scrap heap. But the church has to be saying, no, you messed up. So let's now face that with honesty and bring Jesus into the picture, who can put the pieces back together again.
That's so helpful, Andy. I think off the back of that, the way in which the gospel functions, I think one of the lies that pornography offers is that it will, as it said, satisfy you, isn't it? So I love the image Michael mentioned earlier of the ibuprofen as an analogy, really. That ibuprofen is an anti-inflammatory, and it's almost like the sense in which your inflamed lust can be satiated here, and the lie is it will be, and we'll just dampen that flame, and actually it doesn't. It actually increases it, and it channels it in such a way that it can never be fulfilled, and you're addicted to the addiction. Almost it keeps you addicted to the arousal that particular thing will stimulate, and actually it's not going to satisfy you ever. It's almost like becoming indebted to something that can't ever pay your debt. And you think of what the heart of the gospel is. The end of man, as the Westminster Catechism will say, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So the joy, even the ecstasy in sexual fulfillment, is not divorced from theology, as weird as that might seem to some people. You can think, sex is not something that God doesn't really interest. Actually, he invented it. He invented the joy and the ecstasy that you will get. You can have a cheap version of it here, but he's designed something unique for it in marriage. And that's actually linked to the gospel even. There's a sense of the ecstasy people look for here, which is ultimately fulfilled elsewhere and can only be fulfilled in their creator and their redeemer who makes their restless, inflamed souls restful in him, in the Augustinian phrase. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him. So there's something there about God, what the gospel, God does in the gospel at liberating you from those terrible pathways which you're constantly being tempted to go down and actually will never fulfill you and are always terrible and hard to get out of. God will actually come down there, wrench you out of them, and place you where you need to be, and place you amongst people who love you and in a community who can help you. So that's the only thing I've done on the back of that. Go on, Michael.
Absolutely. No, that is a great place to bring things to a close. And I think that's just very encouraging to think that actually we don't just have, you know, a moral framework, but we have a God who's willing to come and help us in that. And actually, one of the things is worth saying is that, as we said at the beginning, one of the reasons why Christians are afraid of talking about this is because we are afraid of being prudish. But actually, one of the reasons why we want to talk about it is not because we think sex is bad, but because we want to say, actually, no, sex is really, really precious. We live in a culture that has treated it as valueless or cheap. And we want to say, actually, no, we want to reclaim that as something beautiful for what it is, created by God, and also what it points us towards in Christ. But anyway, we are pretty much out of time for this episode. So for now, I guess all that's to say is please do give us a like, a subscribe, or whatever if you found this helpful. If you've enjoyed Pod of the Gaps, why not recommend it to someone else if you think that they might find it helpful too. Not necessarily this episode. That might seem as a little bit of a moral challenge to someone, but indeed, if it is, then do send that one too. And do listen up for more episodes of Pod of the Gaps coming soon. So from Aaron and Andy and myself, goodbye.